It all started on a bright Saturday morning when I stepped out to water my garden. The sun was shining, birds were chirping, and everything seemed peaceful. I had no idea that this seemingly normal day would mark the beginning of a full-blown battle with the HOA's most infamous resident. Karen wasn't just any neighbor. She had a reputation for being controlling, nosy, and aggressive whenever anyone dared to do something against the rules, at least in her eyes. Living in a suburban community with an active HOA, most people learned to stay on her good side, but I had never been one to tolerate unreasonable behavior. That morning, I was about to find out just how far Karen would go when she thought she had the authority to dictate how I lived in my own home. I was trimming my rose bushes near the front of my property when I first noticed Karen standing at the edge of her driveway, her arms crossed and a glare that could freeze the sun. At first, I waved, thinking she might just want to say hello or comment on my garden. Instead, she stormed across the street like a storm cloud rolling over a sunny day. By the time she reached the sidewalk in front of my house, I could see the fury in her eyes. Her voice, sharp and insistent, cut through the air as she began demanding to know why I hadn't followed the HOA guidelines for front yard appearance, guidelines that, as far as I knew, I was already following perfectly. I tried to explain politely that my bushes were trimmed according to the HOA regulations. My lawn was freshly mowed, and my decorations were all approved months ago. But Karen wasn't interested in listening. She waved a printed sheet in my face, filled with highlighted text from HOA rules, each line more absurd than the last. According to her, even the slight curve of my driveway stones was unacceptable. I stood there, stunned, trying to comprehend how someone could be so fixated on controlling every tiny detail of my property. What started as a simple disagreement over a garden had now escalated into a full confrontation, and I could feel the tension in the air thickening with every word. Karen's accusations became louder and more aggressive, and soon she was yelling about fines, penalties, and even threatening to report me to the HOA board immediately. Neighbors started peeking from their windows, some shaking their heads in disbelief at her over-the-top behavior. It was clear that Karen thrived on this sense of power, relishing the idea of controlling the lives of those around her. But I wasn't intimidated, and something inside me told me I needed to stand my ground. I calmly told her that I had done nothing wrong and that I expected her to leave my property immediately. Her face turned red with anger, and she began pacing back and forth, as if searching for the perfect way to escalate the situation further. Within minutes, Karen decided to cross the line completely. She stormed up to my mailbox and started snapping photos of it, muttering about how it was non-compliant and that I was risking fines or worse. I watched in disbelief as she measured the height of the mailbox with a tape measure she had obviously brought just for this purpose. Her obsession with enforcing rules that didn't apply to me was shocking, but also revealing. Karen wasn't just a neighbor who liked order. She was someone who thrived on exerting control over others. I knew that engaging in a shouting match wouldn't accomplish anything, so I decided to document the situation. I started filming discreetly with my phone, capturing every action, every word, and every aggressive gesture she made. I knew that if this escalated to a legal or HOA dispute, I would need solid evidence, and this moment was shaping up to be exactly that. Karen, oblivious to the fact that she was being recorded, continued ranting, pointing fingers, and demanding compliance. She had clearly decided that my home wasn't mine, but hers to monitor, and that I was the enemy standing in the way of her self-appointed mission to control the neighborhood. The climax of the morning came when Karen, in a final act of audacity, tried to physically enter my front yard, stepping over the small decorative fence I had installed. I calmly asked her to step back, explaining that she was trespassing. At that point, the neighbors who had been watching started to murmur, some even stepping outside to observe. Karen's expression shifted from rage to a mix of shock and indignation, as if she couldn't comprehend that anyone would dare resist her authority. That was the exact moment when it became clear that her sense of control had limits. And for the first time, I saw hesitation in her eyes. By the time the HOA board sent an official notice later that day, warning her against further harassment, Karen was already seething with frustration. The video footage I had captured not only documented her aggression, but also showed her overstepping boundaries in a way that made it clear to anyone reviewing it that she was in the wrong. That day marked the beginning of a long, drawn-out battle. But more importantly, it was the day I realized just how far one determined HOA Karen would go to try to assert control, and how important it was to stand up for yourself when someone crosses the line. Looking back, that Saturday morning was a turning point. It was the day a simple act of maintaining my own property turned into a showdown with the neighborhood's most notorious enforcer. Karen's obsession with rules, her need for control, and her lack of respect for personal boundaries set the stage for everything that followed. And though she thought she had all the power, that day planted the first seeds of her regret. A regret that would only grow as the story unfolded further, revealing just how disastrous it can be when HOA authority meets someone who refuses to back down. The tension that had started with Karen's morning confrontation didn't fade. It only grew stronger as the week went on. At first, I tried to brush it off as a one-time overreaction, assuming that her obsession with rules and property lines was just another quirk of living in a neighborhood dominated by HOA politics. But Karen was relentless. Every time I stepped outside, watered my garden, or even parked my car in my own driveway, she seemed to find a way to insert herself into my day. At first, it was subtle, a pointed glance, a muttered comment under her breath, a note left on my mailbox about some imagined violation. But soon, her actions escalated, turning harassment into something deeply personal. It started with the letters. Every day, Karen would leave notes criticizing trivial things. My lawn edging wasn't straight. My flowers weren't planted in the approved color pattern, or my porch decorations weren't symmetrical. She wrote with a kind of precision that suggested she spent hours plotting these little attacks, looking for the tiniest imperfection. Initially, I tried to respond politely, explaining that everything was compliant with HOA rules. But Karen wasn't interested in compliance. She was interested in control. Each note she left became more aggressive, more accusatory, and more public. She even began placing them in front of my neighbors' homes, ensuring that anyone walking by could see her complaints. The harassment didn't stop with notes. One evening, as I was leaving for work, I noticed her standing near my driveway with a clipboard, measuring my property's walkway while muttering under her breath. I confronted her, asking why she was invading my personal space, but she simply smiled condescendingly and said she was ensuring HOA compliance. It was clear at that moment that Karen's mission had nothing to do with rules and everything to do with asserting dominance. It wasn't long before neighbors began noticing the tension. Some tried to intervene or offer support, but others, wary of Karen's reputation, kept their distance. The neighborhood had seen her before, and most people had learned to steer clear, afraid of becoming her next target. What made it personal, however, wasn't just the constant scrutiny. It was the way Karen began targeting my family and daily routines. She questioned the times my children played in the yard, complained about the cars my family drove, and even called out small gatherings of friends for being loud or non-compliant. Every interaction was designed to make me feel uncomfortable in my own home, to disrupt my peace, and to send a message that she was in control. The stress started to weigh on me, making me question every action and decision I made on my property. The harassment, once about trivial HOA rules, had turned into a personal vendetta, and I realized that Karen's obsession was no longer about property. It was about power. One afternoon, the situation reached a boiling point. I had hosted a small neighborhood barbecue, inviting a few close friends and neighbors. Karen appeared out of nowhere, peering over the fence, taking notes, and loudly criticizing every detail, from the placement of lawn chairs to the way food was displayed. I confronted her, asking why she couldn't respect our home and our event. But she waved me off, claiming that she was ensuring community standards. My friends exchanged awkward glances, and the atmosphere that was supposed to be lighthearted became tense and uncomfortable. That day, I realized that the harassment had become a public spectacle. Karen wasn't just making my life difficult privately. She was turning it into a neighborhood-wide drama. It was during moments like this that I started documenting everything meticulously. I captured photos of her intrusive behavior, recorded videos of her confrontations, and kept detailed logs of each incident. It wasn't just for my own peace of mind. It was a precaution. I knew that eventually, the situation might require intervention from the HOA board or even legal authorities. The evidence started piling up quickly. Photos of notes left on my doorstep, videos of her measuring my driveway, and witnesses from neighbors who had seen the confrontations firsthand. The neighborhood was beginning to see Karen for what she truly was, not just a stickler for rules, but a bully hiding behind HOA authority. The turning point came when her actions began affecting other neighbors as well. Karen started attempting to police their properties too, offering unsolicited advice and leaving notes that criticized minor infractions. Many neighbors, tired of her harassment, began talking among themselves. And slowly, a sense of solidarity began forming. People who had once been afraid to speak up now had evidence of Karen's overreach and started to openly discuss how ridiculous her behavior had become. By turning her obsession into a public spectacle, Karen had inadvertently united the neighborhood against her. Her need for control had backfired, and the very people she thought she dominated were now quietly documenting her actions and preparing to push back. Despite this growing neighborhood awareness, Karen didn't stop. She continued to target me personally, leaving increasingly aggressive notes, filming my property, and even showing up at odd hours to monitor my compliance. It became clear that she thrived on confrontation and believed that intimidation was a form of power. But with the neighborhood now aware of her antics and with my evidence mounting, the harassment started to feel less effective. Karen's personal vendetta, once private and terrifying, was now exposed to the entire community. What had started as a private conflict had escalated into a situation where Karen's reputation was on the line, and her behavior was being scrutinized like never before. By the end of the week, it was obvious that Karen's harassment had reached a tipping point. While she may have thought she was controlling me, the opposite had happened. I had documented everything, involved the community, and now had leverage that could not be ignored. The neighborhood, who had once been passive observers, were now witnesses to her actions. Karen had turned personal obsession into public exposure, and the stage was set for the consequences that were about to follow. What had begun as routine HOA enforcement had turned into a personal war, and Karen was about to discover that crossing the line against the wrong homeowner could have repercussions far beyond what she ever imagined. It was a warm Saturday morning, and the neighborhood seemed calm, almost deceptively peaceful, as if nothing could disturb the quiet routine of suburban life. But that morning, Karen had other plans. After days of harassment, notes, and passive-aggressive comments, she decided it was time to escalate in a way that would make her infamous reputation even more apparent. What she didn't realize, however, was that crossing the line in public would turn her entire world upside down, and it would be the beginning of a dramatic shift in power that no HOA rule could control. I was outside doing some yard work when I noticed her approaching from across the street, her posture rigid and determined. This wasn't her usual pacing along the sidewalk or leaving notes in secret. She was on a mission, carrying her clipboard, tape measure, and a camera, her eyes scanning every inch of my property like a hawk hunting prey. I could feel the tension in the air immediately. Neighbors were starting to peek from their windows, sensing that something big was about to happen. Karen had clearly decided that my home, my family, and my sense of peace were now fair game for public confrontation. As soon as she reached my driveway, she began loudly announcing that my home was non-compliant with HOA regulations. Her voice carried down the street, sharp and insistent, ensuring that anyone within earshot could hear her accusations. I calmly walked toward her, asking her to respect my property, but she ignored me completely. Instead, she pointed at the mailbox, the fence, and even the tiniest cracks in my walkway, making exaggerated claims about violations that didn't exist. Neighbors who had once been silent spectators began to gather, some stepping onto their lawns to see what was unfolding. Karen's sense of power seemed to grow as her audience expanded, and I quickly realized she intended to make a public spectacle out of this confrontation. What made this moment significant wasn't just the loud accusations or her blatant disregard for personal boundaries. It was how she chose to involve the entire community. Karen began calling out my family members by name, questioning why my children were playing outside, criticizing the way my spouse had parked the car, and even interrogating a neighbor who had simply stopped by to say hello. Her behavior was aggressive and invasive, but also incredibly foolish. By dragging other people into her feud, she revealed the true nature of her obsession. It wasn't about rules. It was about domination, control, and humiliation. I stayed calm, refusing to rise to the bait. Instead, I started recording her actions on my phone, capturing every gesture, every accusation, and every word. Karen, completely unaware that she was being documented, continued her tirade, her voice now carrying a mixture of frustration and desperation. It was clear that in her mind, she was winning. She had a captive audience, and she believed that she could publicly shame me into compliance. But what she didn't understand was that the moment had shifted. By crossing the line in public, she had opened herself up to scrutiny in a way that no private note or whispered comment ever could. Neighbors who had once been hesitant to interfere began murmuring among themselves. Some expressed disbelief at her extreme behavior, while others quietly acknowledged that they had experienced similar harassment. Her public outburst inadvertently united the community, creating a network of witnesses who could confirm everything that had been happening behind closed doors. Karen's strategy of intimidation had backfired spectacularly. What she intended as a demonstration of power became evidence of recklessness and obsession. The situation escalated further when Karen attempted to physically approach the property line to measure the driveway herself, ignoring repeated requests to stay off my property. At this point, a few neighbors stepped in, calmly telling her that she was trespassing and that her behavior was inappropriate. For the first time, I saw uncertainty flash across her face. Karen, who had always thrived on fear and compliance, suddenly realized that the people around her were no longer intimidated. Her aura of authority, carefully cultivated over years of bullying, was cracking under the weight of public scrutiny. In the following moments, the confrontation reached a peak. Karen began shouting at the neighbors, accusing them of taking my side, claiming that they were violating HOA rules by not supporting her. But by now, her audience had changed. Instead of fear, they were filled with skepticism and quiet amusement at her meltdown. Her credibility, once unquestioned in her own mind, was collapsing. People whispered to each other, exchanged glances, and some even laughed quietly, a subtle but telling sign that Karen's power over the community was fading rapidly. The turning point came when I calmly pointed out that her measurements and accusations were baseless, and that I had documented proof of compliance. Holding up my phone, I showed her that every note, every inspection, and every violation she had pointed out had been recorded, along with dates, times, and supporting evidence. Karen froze, caught off guard by the very proof that she had never anticipated. Her reaction was priceless, a mixture of anger, embarrassment, and disbelief. The entire neighborhood could see it. And in that moment, the balance of power shifted completely. By the end of the morning, Karen retreated, muttering threats under her breath, but noticeably shaken. The public confrontation had not gone according to her plan. Instead of intimidating me or the neighborhood, she had exposed herself as obsessive, unreasonable, and overly controlling. Witnesses who had once been passive observers were now active participants in documenting her behavior. What was meant to be a demonstration of dominance had become a vivid lesson in overreach, showing that crossing the line publicly can have immediate and lasting consequences. From that day on, Karen's approach changed slightly. While she continued to monitor the neighborhood obsessively, she became more cautious, aware that any public escalation could be captured and exposed. The damage to her reputation, however, was done. She had crossed the line in public, and that single act marked the beginning of her decline in influence. What she had thought would be a show of power turned into a public display of her own instability, and it became clear to everyone, including her, that when HOA authority is abused, instant regret is never far behind. After the public confrontation, I knew that Karen's behavior wasn't going to stop on its own. The incident had not only exposed her overreach to the neighborhood, but had also set the stage for a larger showdown. While some neighbors offered sympathetic comments, I understood that relying solely on public opinion wouldn't be enough. I needed concrete evidence, and more importantly, I needed to understand the legal and HOA boundaries that could finally bring Karen's escalating harassment to an end. That's when I started taking things seriously, preparing methodically for the inevitable consequences of her actions. The first step was documenting every single incident meticulously. I had already recorded videos of her public tirade, photos of the violations she had invented, and detailed notes of each interaction. But I also began gathering supporting evidence, such as previous HOA communications, rulebooks, and emails, to establish a clear record that I was always in compliance. Every note Karen had left, every tape measure inspection she had conducted, and every accusation she had made became a piece of the puzzle. What had started as a simple record keeping exercise now became a weapon, a way to show the HOA board, legal authorities, or even skeptical neighbors that her harassment was not only unwarranted, but also documented beyond dispute. Next, I consulted with a local attorney who specialized in HOA disputes. I explained the entire situation, showing the evidence I had collected and describing the public confrontations. The attorney's advice was precise and eye-opening. While HOAs have certain rights to enforce community rules, no member, not even a board member, has the right to harass, intimidate, or trespass on private property. In other words, Karen had crossed the line legally as well as socially. With this professional guidance, I felt more confident that I could challenge her behavior effectively, and perhaps even involve the HOA board in a decisive way. Armed with documentation and legal advice, I approached the HOA board. I presented the evidence calmly and professionally, ensuring that every photo, video, and note was dated and clearly explained. The board members listened intently, some taking notes, others nodding in disbelief. It was clear that many of them had heard rumors about Karen's behavior, but had never seen such a comprehensive record. By the end of the meeting, the board agreed that her actions constituted harassment and that immediate measures were needed to prevent further escalation. Meanwhile, Karen, unaware that I had brought in both legal and HOA authority, continued her attempts to assert control, but her power was eroding rapidly. Each time she tried to issue a new complaint or intimidate a neighbor, she met subtle resistance. A neighbor calmly pointing out compliance, a camera recording her actions, or the knowledge that I had already alerted the board. Her usual tactics, which had once been terrifyingly effective, now faltered under the weight of scrutiny. For the first time, she experienced hesitation, uncertainty, and fear, emotions she rarely allowed herself to feel when confronting others. The critical moment came when the HOA issued an official warning. The letter was clear and uncompromising. Karen was instructed to cease her harassment immediately, refrain from trespassing, and respect the boundaries of other homeowners. It included references to specific HOA rules as well as legal disclaimers, emphasizing that any further violations could result in fines or legal action. For Karen, the letter was a blow to her ego and authority. She had always believed herself untouchable, shielded by her self-appointed role as the neighborhood enforcer. Suddenly, the very system she had used to justify her power was now turning against her. At that moment, I witnessed the crack in her armor. Her expressions shifted from anger to disbelief, then to frustration, and finally to silent rage. She realized that her obsession with control had not only failed, but had exposed her to public scrutiny and official reprimand. Neighbors who had once feared her now watched with subtle satisfaction, seeing the consequences of unchecked aggression. It was a turning point, both for her and for the neighborhood dynamic. The intimidation, manipulation, and constant surveillance she had relied upon were no longer effective. The balance of power had shifted decisively, and it was all rooted in careful documentation, legal knowledge, and strategic action. From that day forward, Karen's attempts to harass anyone in the neighborhood became rare and cautious. She continued to participate in community affairs, but the fear she had once instilled was gone. Her power, which had been built on a combination of aggression and rule enforcement, was now limited by accountability and transparency. The very system she thought she could manipulate had revealed the truth. Crossing the line in harassment and overstepping boundaries has consequences, and those consequences can be swift, public, and irreversible. Reflecting on the experience, I realized that the combination of evidence, law, and community support was crucial. Karen's downfall wasn't a single event. It was a culmination of careful preparation, smart documentation, and a willingness to stand firm while others watched. By understanding the rules, leveraging the legal framework, and maintaining composure under pressure, I had transformed what could have been a prolonged battle into a decisive turning point. Karen had finally faced the reality that her power was not absolute, that her aggression could be countered, and that crossing the line in public, without accountability, was her biggest mistake. The lesson was clear. Harassment, no matter how persistent or calculated, can be challenged effectively with preparation, strategy, and courage. Karen's moment of crack in power marked the beginning of her decline in influence, and it also served as a reminder to the entire neighborhood that standing up for oneself, combined with proper documentation and legal awareness, can overcome even the most notorious HOA tyrants. After the official warning from the HOA, the shift in the neighborhood dynamic was immediate and unmistakable. Karen, who had once strutted around as the self-appointed authority, now walked with a subtle hesitancy. Her confident glare, once sharp enough to make neighbors shrink in fear, now faltered whenever anyone passed by. The very people she had tried to intimidate were now quietly observing her, aware that her power was no longer absolute. It was almost poetic justice. The very obsession with control that had driven her daily life was unraveling before her eyes. And for the first time, she felt the weight of consequence. The first sign of real regret came when she attempted to confront me in my yard again. She arrived with the familiar clipboard and tape measure, expecting the same fear and compliance she had seen in others. But instead of intimidation, she was met with calm composure and a phone recording every motion. Neighbors peeked out of their windows, some stepping onto their lawns, not to escalate the confrontation, but to witness what was happening. Karen's usual bravado faltered instantly. She opened her mouth to speak, then paused, realizing that her actions were now being observed by witnesses who could report any misstep to the HOA or even law enforcement. Her confidence, which had long been her weapon, evaporated under the weight of accountability. The next few days revealed just how deeply the public confrontation and HOA involvement had affected her credibility. Once she was seen publicly documenting trivial violations, her reputation as a strict rule enforcer shifted into that of a petty, obsessive busybody. Neighbors whispered, exchanged glances, and, in some cases, openly chuckled at the absurdity of her antics. Children played in their yards without fear of being scolded by Karen, and neighbors who had once walked on eggshells began reclaiming their own spaces. Karen's credibility had been built on fear and compliance, and when both were stripped away, her influence crumbled rapidly. One afternoon, I overheard a conversation between two longtime neighbors. They were talking about Karen, her obsession with control, and how quickly her power had declined. She doesn't scare anyone anymore. One of them said, "She went too far this time." Hearing those words confirmed what I had seen. Karen's authority, once absolute, was now a fragile illusion. Her instant regret wasn't just personal. It was public. The neighborhood had witnessed her escalation, her aggression, and her eventual defeat, and that collective memory would follow her for a long time. Even within the HOA, Karen's influence diminished dramatically. Board members who had once tolerated her input and complaints now treated her suggestions with polite skepticism. When she tried to bring up minor infractions from other neighbors, her comments were met with reminders of the official warning and references to the documented evidence of her own overreach. Karen realized, painfully, that her attempts to assert dominance were now constrained by rules she could no longer manipulate. The system she had relied on to reinforce her power was now enforcing limits on her behavior, and she had no one to blame but herself. Her personal reaction was also telling. She no longer issued notes daily, measured property lines obsessively, or appeared in public to lecture neighbors. When she did approach someone, her words were hesitant, lacking the certainty and aggression she once wielded like a weapon. It was clear that she had learned a hard lesson. Crossing boundaries, especially publicly, can result in consequences that are immediate and undeniable. The same energy she had invested in intimidation was now replaced with quiet regret, as she realized the extent to which her reputation had been tarnished. For me, the culmination of this saga was both satisfying and instructive. The process of standing firm, documenting every action involving the HOA, and remaining calm under pressure had transformed what could have been a prolonged harassment ordeal into a decisive victory. Karen's instant regret became visible in every hesitant glance, every muffled complaint, and every failed attempt to assert authority. The neighborhood, once passive witnesses, now recognized the importance of accountability, and my example reinforced the idea that even the most notorious HOA tyrants could be confronted effectively when armed with evidence, strategy, and composure. Interestingly, Karen's own behavior also served as a lesson to others in the community. Neighbors who had once tolerated minor intrusions or overreaches began to see the boundaries of acceptable HOA conduct more clearly. Her downfall illustrated the principle that unchecked power, when misused, can collapse under scrutiny. Karen's regret wasn't just instant in her personal realization. It was instant in the shift of community perception. The fear she had relied upon for years vanished almost overnight, replaced by a collective awareness that rules are meant to be enforced fairly, not manipulated to control or intimidate. Over time, Karen attempted to reintegrate into the neighborhood, but the impact of her actions lingered. Her attempts to reclaim authority were met with polite but firm resistance, a reflection of the credibility she had lost. While she may have continued to participate in HOA activities, the aura of control she once wielded was gone. The neighborhood now functioned with a renewed sense of balance, where compliance and accountability coexisted, and where Karen's instant regret became a cautionary tale for anyone tempted to misuse power. In the end, her story serves as a powerful reminder. Crossing the line, especially publicly, can have swift and undeniable consequences. Karen's obsession with control, once her greatest strength, became her downfall, and the moment of instant regret was both visible and irreversible. It was a victory for reason, accountability, and the neighborhood as a whole. Standing up for oneself, documenting actions carefully, and involving the appropriate authorities transformed a situation that could have been intimidating into a story of triumph. Karen had lost control, credibility, and the fear she had long relied upon.
If you enjoy real
leaving behind a
HOA
neighborhood
Karen stories
that had
where
witnessed the true
entitlement meets
consequences of
consequences,
unchecked aggression.
subscribe now. More stories like this are coming. If you enjoy real HOA Karen stories where entitlement meets consequences, subscribe now. More stories like this are coming.